The day of the auction had arrived, and the large hall was filled with a strange mix of anticipation and indifference. It was not the kind of event that attracted crowds. Most people came out of necessity or curiosity, but there was an unmistakable air of neglect about this particular sale. The items on offer were not ordinary goods, they were humans. Or at least, what the world called humans. They were synthetics, artificial people built to perform tasks, help in homes, work in factories, or provide companionship. But this auction was different. These particular synthetics were labeled as defective, and the word defective hung heavily over the room like a cloud. It suggested they were broken, flawed, or somehow less than useful. Most attendees had already decided they weren't interested. They came expecting cheap deals on items they could fix, repurpose, or discard without much thought. Dr. Elias Rowan, a man in his late 40s with a calm but penetrating gaze, stood quietly at the back of the hall. He had seen hundreds of auctions like this one over the years, and yet something about this batch of defective synthetics made him pay closer attention. While the others whispered to each other, making jokes about cheap garbage, Elias observed with careful, almost clinical attention. He noticed the way the synthetics were brought in one by one on mechanical trolleys. Their movements slightly stiff, their eyes flickering unnaturally. They did not behave like the perfectly functional models he had worked with before. Most people shrugged and murmured to themselves, noting the defects, checking their devices, and preparing to leave if a better deal didn't appear. But Elias felt a pull of curiosity in something deeper he couldn't yet name. The auctioneer, a large man with a booming voice and a mechanical arm that moved with precise efficiency, began calling out the first lot. The synthetics were lined up on a raised platform, each with a tag pinned to their chest. The tags were simple but damning: defective, unreliable, malfunctioning. It was a harsh word for a harsh judgment. The crowd scanned the synthetics quickly, mostly looking for the obvious flaws. One model had a hand that jittered uncontrollably. Another had a voice that occasionally skipped in a high-pitched stutter. A few units seemed unusually quiet, their heads tilted in ways that suggested confusion or hesitation. Most buyers saw only the problems. They whispered about repair costs, potential hazards, and whether anyone would want to own such machines. Some people even laughed, calling them useless, as if mocking their very existence gave them satisfaction. But Elias's eyes did not focus on the flaws. He watched the synthetics closely, looking beyond the physical glitches. He noticed tiny, human-like behaviors that the auction house and the other buyers had completely ignored. A caretaker model rocked slightly, cradling an invisible child in its arms, as if instinctively trying to comfort something that wasn't there. A construction unit froze when a bright light flashed, pausing mid-step as though it had seen something traumatic and needed to process it. Even the quiet models displayed subtle movements, fingers brushing imaginary surfaces, eyes darting as if following thoughts of their own. Elias realized that these behaviors were not malfunctions. They were reactions, remnants of experiences that the synthetics had somehow absorbed over time. They carried memories, responses, and perhaps even feelings. The auctioneer's voice rose again, calling for bids, but the crowd remained silent. Nobody wanted to take a risk on something that could behave unpredictably. Elias noticed the tension in the room. There was a collective fear of the unknown. People were used to synthetics that followed commands perfectly, that performed without hesitation or thought. Anything outside of that expectation was a threat to the rules they had grown comfortable with. Defective synthetics, in their minds, were dangerous precisely because they were not fully controllable. While others saw flaws, Elias saw individuality, an unexpected spark of life in machines that had been treated as disposable. He thought about the life of a synthetic like a person's life, filled with small events, mistakes, and learning experiences. Even though they were built by humans, each one had accumulated its own history. The glitches, the odd behaviors, the hesitations, they were like scars, proof of survival and adaptation. Elias understood that the world had rejected these synthetics not because they were broken, but because they were unpredictable. Humanity often fears what it cannot control, and in this hall, unpredictability was treated as a crime. He felt a mix of sadness and determination. These synthetics deserved more than an auction table and a label of defective. They deserved someone who could see their potential, someone who could help them reclaim purpose and dignity. Elias's attention sharpened as more units were brought onto the platform. Each one revealed something different, something that the auction house and the buyers had ignored. One model hesitated when asked to move a box, but then gently set it down as if thinking about the consequences of a careless action. Another turned its head toward a small child in the crowd, watching silently with what appeared to be concern. Elias realized that these units were not malfunctioning in a technical sense. They were malfunctioning in the eyes of people who expected perfection. They were demonstrating behavior that was adaptive, moral, and perhaps even compassionate. That was something the other attendees could not or would not understand. As the auction progressed, Elias remained calm, his mind working faster than anyone else's in the room. While others calculated potential profits, repair costs, or resale value, he analyzed the subtle cues, the unusual gestures, and the tiny signs of intelligence that had been dismissed as errors. He began to form a plan in his head, an idea that seemed almost impossible. What if he could take all of them, the entire group, and show the world what they could really be? He knew it would be risky, and that others would think him foolish. But the spark of hope he saw in the eyes of these synthetics made the risk worthwhile. The room continued to murmur and shift with impatience. Buyers whispered to each other, some leaving in frustration. The auctioneer, growing increasingly irritated, called out again, expecting to move on to other lots. But Elias did not move. He stayed at the back, observing, calculating, imagining a future where these so-called defective synthetics were not ignored, not discarded, but given a chance to thrive. He understood that this was more than an auction. It was a moment where the ordinary rules of society clashed with something extraordinary. In that crowded hall, filled with indifference and fear, Elias saw potential, individuality, and a chance to redefine what it meant to be considered useful or valuable. By the time the first bidding call ended without a single offer, Elias had already made his decision. While the room sighed in relief or disappointment, depending on perspective, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. These synthetics were not broken, they were misunderstood, mislabeled and undervalued. He knew that he would have to act quickly if he wanted to save them from being discarded forever. The other attendees might never see what he saw, but that did not matter. He had recognized something rare, something important, and for the first time that day, amidst the clamor of an indifferent crowd, Elias felt a spark of excitement and purpose that no auction or label could ever extinguish. The moment the first defective synthetic stepped onto the platform, it became clear that these were not ordinary machines. Each one moved differently, with subtle hesitations, gestures, and expressions that seemed almost human. The crowd barely noticed these details. Most buyers focused only on the obvious faults, the flickering eyes, the jittery hands, or the strange pauses in movement. But Dr. Elias Rowan watched everything. He could see that these tiny quirks, which others called flaws, were actually signs of individuality. Each synthetic seemed to carry a fragment of experience, a memory, or a reaction that went beyond its programming. It was as if each had a story to tell, one that had been ignored or dismissed by everyone else. The first unit on the platform was a caretaker model, designed to assist with children and household management. Most buyers laughed as it cradled an invisible infant, rocking gently as if soothing a child who didn't exist. To the crowd, this behavior looked broken or pointless. The auctioneer even muttered under his breath, "Just another useless defect." But Elias noticed something different. He could see a protective instinct in the way the synthetic held itself, a carefulness in every movement. It wasn't broken. It was showing empathy, a quality that no perfect programming could force. The synthetic was alive in its own way, responding to what it had learned, what it had felt, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. Next came a construction model, tall and broad, built to lift heavy loads and perform precise tasks on dangerous sites. As it moved forward, its steps faltered and it paused suddenly. A bright spotlight swept across the stage, and the unit froze completely, hands hovering mid-air. Buyers whispered nervously, worried about potential malfunctions. But Elias noticed the reason for the hesitation. The synthetic had clearly witnessed an accident at some point and had retained a memory of it. Its pause was not a flaw, it was caution, a sign that it had processed a dangerous event and had learned to react carefully. Elias thought about how humans, after trauma, often hesitate in certain situations, sometimes forever. This synthetic was doing the same, only it was labeled defective rather than being understood. A household assistant moved quietly onto the platform next. Unlike other synthetics, it hummed a soft, almost melodic tune to itself, swaying gently as if calming its own thoughts. Buyers exchanged confused looks, some chuckling at what they assumed was a glitch in its sound system. Elias, however, leaned forward, captivated. The hum was not random, it was a coping mechanism. This synthetic, like a human under stress, had found a way to soothe itself in a world that demanded perfection and compliance. Elias realized that this behavior demonstrated intelligence, creativity, and adaptability, qualities no one at the auction recognized as valuable. One by one, the synthetics were displayed. Some had minor physical glitches, like a hand that twitched or a voice that stuttered unexpectedly. Others displayed emotional behaviors, hesitation, curiosity, or a strange attention to things that did not exist in the physical world. A few units tilted their heads as if listening to whispers only they could hear. Others shifted nervously, watching the crowd as though unsure why they had been brought here. To Elias, each gesture revealed a story, a fragment of a life that had been overlooked. These were not defective machines. They were survivors of experiences, adapting and reacting in ways that showed personality, memory, and sensitivity. The crowd remained largely uninterested. Most buyers whispered among themselves about the risks of purchasing such units. They calculated repair costs, potential hazards, and resale value, completely missing the uniqueness of what stood before them. Some buyers even joked about buying a haunted machine or getting a useless toy. Elias ignored the chatter. He was beginning to understand that these synthetics were unlike anything anyone had encountered before. Their behaviors were unpredictable, yes, but in ways that reflected learning, emotion, and individuality. They were far more alive than any standard, perfectly programmed unit. Yet no one was willing to see it. As the auction continued, Ilias's mind worked rapidly. He studied each synthetic closely, noticing small details that others dismissed. The caretaker model's fingers moved with delicate precision, mimicking actions it had performed before. The construction unit's hesitation was mirrored in its gaze, scanning the environment carefully. The household assistant's humming had a rhythm, almost like a song it had created for comfort. These were not defects, they were signs of consciousness, fragments of memory, and perhaps even early expressions of emotion. Elias felt a mixture of awe and determination. He realized that if he wanted to help these synthetics, he would need to act quickly. The world was ready to discard them, but he was not. He also noticed something else, a subtle bond forming among the synthetics themselves. Though they were displayed one by one, they seemed to recognize each other, their movements sometimes synchronized or mirrored. A protective stance here, a comforting gesture there, they responded to one another's presence. Almost like a family of sorts, Ilias recognized that they were not just individuals. They were a community, capable of interaction and care beyond what anyone had expected. The other attendees did not see this connection. They saw only units to buy, sell, or ignore. But Elias could see the beginnings of relationships, cooperation, and understanding among them. Elias's excitement grew as the auction continued. He imagined a future where these synthetics were not discarded, not labeled defective, but given the chance to heal, learn, and function in ways that standard units could never achieve. He thought about how society demanded perfection from machines, punishing deviations without understanding them. These synthetics were not failures, they were misunderstood, each carrying its own history, its own way of interacting with the world. They were unique, and in their uniqueness lay potential that no auction or label could contain. By the time the auctioneer was ready to move on to the next lot, Elias had made up his mind. He understood the risks involved. Others might see danger or waste. He saw opportunity and value. Each synthetic displayed on that platform had something to teach, something to offer, something worth saving. They were not simply tools. They were beings with potential to grow, learn, and adapt. Elias realized that he could not allow them to be sold to someone who would discard them or try to force them into standard molds. They needed someone who could understand, nurture, and guide them. Even as buyers murmured, exchanged whispers, and shifted uncomfortably in their seats, Elias remained focused on the synthetics. He studied their every movement, every hesitation, and every subtle gesture. He began to form a plan to take them all, the entire group of so-called defective units, and give them a chance at something new. In his mind, he imagined a place where they could exist safely, learn to express themselves, and become more than the sum of their glitches. He knew that what he was about to do would seem foolish to others, even reckless. But to Elias it was clear, these synthetics were not defective, they were extraordinary. The moment had arrived when the auctioneer started calling for bids, his voice echoing through the hall. The defective synthetics stood on the platform, their movements slightly hesitant, their eyes flickering with the traces of experiences no one had cared to notice. The crowd, which had been murmuring and whispering throughout the earlier displays, suddenly fell silent. Nobody wanted to make the first move. The risks seemed too high, the unknown too dangerous. Each buyer glanced at the other, calculating silently, but no one dared to raise their hand. The room was thick with tension, an odd mix of impatience and fear. Every so-called defect on the platform became a barrier in their minds, something to be avoided, ignored, or laughed at. Dr. Elias Rowan remained calm at the back of the hall, observing the situation. He had spent the last hours studying each synthetic, noting their reactions, their gestures, and the small signs of personality that no one else could see. Now, as the auctioneer's patience began to fray, Elias made a decision that would shock everyone in the room. He would not bid for just 1 or 2 units. He would not settle for a single defective model that might, by chance, show a spark of potential. Instead, he stood up quietly, catching the attention of everyone present. The sudden movement made a ripple of whispers pass through the crowd. All eyes turned to him, curious, skeptical, and in some cases, outright mocking. "I will take all of them," Elias said calmly, his voice steady despite the murmur of disbelief that rose from the audience. The auctioneer paused, his mechanical arm frozen mid-motion. The words hung in the air like a shockwave. Every buyer, technician, and observer in the hall exchanged confused glances. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others whispered that he must be crazy, that no one could possibly want all these defective synthetics, with their glitches, hesitations, and unpredictable behaviors. But Ilias's expression remained unchanged. He had studied these synthetics, understood their quirks, and seen beyond the surface. To him, these units were not broken, they were misunderstood, undervalued, and full of untapped potential. The auctioneer cleared his throat, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Sir, these units come as is," he said, emphasizing the words as though warning Elias of the danger. "They are unpredictable, possibly unsafe, and labeled defective for a reason. Are you sure you want to commit to all of them?" Elias nodded without hesitation. He understood the risks. Some of the synthetics might resist commands, display unusual behaviors, or even fail in ways that could be costly or inconvenient. But he also knew that these challenges were not flaws, they were evidence of individuality, of experience, and of a spark of life that standard models lacked. No risk could outweigh the opportunity to save these synthetics from abandonment. As the auctioneer continued, scanning the crowd for anyone who might challenge Elias's bold move, the room grew restless. Some buyers whispered urgently, concerned about being outbid by a single individual willing to purchase everything. Others began to leave, muttering that it was foolish to stay and waste time. But Elias remained composed, his gaze fixed on the platform. He studied each synthetic one more time, noting the slight quiver in a caretaker's hand, the hesitant step of a construction unit, the soft hum of a household assistant trying to calm itself. These small gestures told him everything he needed to know. These were not defective machines. They were beings capable of growth, adaptation, and perhaps even emotion. The crowd's disbelief grew when Elias calmly wrote his name on the bidding sheet and handed over the required deposit. The auctioneer shook his head, muttering to himself as he processed the paperwork. Technicians checked the units briefly, confirming their status, and then the transaction was finalized. Elias had bought every defective synthetic in the hall. The news spread quickly, sparking gasps and murmurs. People could not understand why someone would take on all these broken units. They could not see the potential that Elias saw. In their eyes, he had made a reckless gamble, a purchase doomed to failure. But Elias did not care. He had made his decision, and he was determined to see it through. Once the paperwork was complete, Elias personally oversaw the loading of the synthetics onto his transport vehicle. It was a slow process, as some units hesitated, unsure of what was happening, and others moved awkwardly, their glitches making the operation tricky. Elias guided each one patiently, speaking softly, giving instructions, and ensuring that no one was left behind. Some buyers in the hall watched in disbelief, muttering that he had taken on a burden far beyond reason. The synthetics themselves seemed to sense the change. Their flickering eyes followed Elias closely, and small gestures suggested they trusted him in a way. They had never trusted the auctioneers or previous owners. During the journey from the auction hall to his facility, Elias had time to observe them more closely. The caretaker model kept its imaginary child in its arms, rocking gently, while the construction unit avoided sudden movements, scanning the environment as if anticipating danger. Even the quietest assistants displayed small signs of awareness, adjusting their posture or tilting their heads as they processed the Elias realized that their unpredictability was not a weakness, it was proof that they were capable of learning, adapting, and responding to new situations. They were alive in ways that standard synthetics could never be, and he felt a growing sense of responsibility to help them realize their potential. As the truck moved through the city streets, Elias began to think about the challenges ahead. Each synthetic would need care, understanding, and guidance. Their behaviors, once labeled as defects, would require patience and insight to navigate. Some might resist, some might display fear, and some might seem beyond repair. But Elias believed that, with the right environment and approach, they could overcome these challenges and become more than what the auction hall had condemned them to be. They had a spark of individuality that, if nurtured, could grow into something remarkable. By the time they arrived at his facility, Elias had already planned the next steps. The synthetics would not be repaired in the traditional sense. Their memories, experiences, and subtle behaviors would not be erased. Instead, he would study them, help them adapt, and provide a space where they could learn and heal. He understood that this was not just about functionality or compliance, it was about giving these units a chance to exist fully, to express themselves, and to demonstrate capabilities that no one at the auction had been willing to recognize. The road ahead would be difficult, and there was no guarantee of success. But Elias's conviction never wavered. As he watched the synthetics step off the transport truck and enter his facility, Elias felt a sense of accomplishment and hope. They were no longer labeled defective in his eyes. They were survivors, each carrying a story, a lesson, and the potential for growth. He knew that the world would not understand his decision, and that many would continue to see them as flawed machines. But Elias also knew that he had done the right thing. He had chosen to stand against the indifference and fear of others and to give these synthetics a chance at something better, a chance to be seen, understood, and valued for what they truly were. Once Dr. Elias Rowan had safely transported all the defective synthetics to his remote facility, the real work began. The place was designed not like a standard workshop or repair center, but as a sanctuary. High ceilings allowed light to pour in through wide windows, and soft sounds filled the air. Gentle music, birdsong from outside, and the quiet hum of machines working in harmony with humans. There were rooms for study, spaces for rest, and areas where each synthetic could move freely without the constant pressure of performance or expectation. Elias knew that to help them, he could not treat them like tools. He had to create an environment where they could learn, adapt, and regain confidence in themselves. The first step was observation. Elias watched each synthetic carefully, taking notes on their movements, gestures, and reactions. The caretaker model, which had cradled an invisible child during the auction, hesitated at first but gradually explored the facility's open spaces. It touched walls lightly, examined objects, and occasionally paused to hum a soft tune. Elias realized that this humming was not a flaw, it was a way of comforting itself, a method to process new experiences. He allowed the synthetic to continue, observing how it interacted with the environment and gently encouraging it when needed. In doing so, he was learning from them just as much as they could learn from him. The construction model, which had hesitated at the auction after witnessing danger, also required patience. At first it moved slowly, testing floors and steps as though anticipating traps. Elias followed it closely, explaining in calm, deliberate tones that the environment was safe. He provided tasks that were small and manageable, moving light objects, arranging simple tools, and observing patterns in its responses. Over time, the synthetic began to act more confidently. Each successful task built a layer of trust, both in its abilities and in Elias as someone who would not force it to act recklessly or ignore its instincts. By allowing it to work at its own pace, Elias was helping the unit regain a sense of competence and purpose. Other synthetics displayed behaviors that revealed layers of complexity previously overlooked. The quiet household assistant wandered through the facility, its movements careful but curious. It paused frequently, seeming to observe patterns in light, shadow, and sound. Elias noticed that it sometimes mimicked gestures he made, suggesting a level of learning and adaptation far beyond what a standard programming update could provide. He encouraged these behaviors, offering small rewards of acknowledgement or simple tasks that allowed it to experiment and explore. Slowly, he began to see each synthetic not as a machine to be fixed, but as a unique individual capable of growth. As days passed, Elias introduced exercises designed to help the synthetics interact with one another. He observed that they had subtle social behaviors, even though they had been programmed primarily for tasks rather than relationships. The caretaker model, for instance, would tilt its head toward another unit as if assessing its state. The construction model began to respond to cues from the caretaker, moving more confidently when guided by the other unit's presence. Even the household assistant engaged in small gestures that suggested empathy or awareness, like moving objects to prevent collisions or pausing to let another synthetic pass. Elias realized that they were developing bonds, supporting one another in ways he had not anticipated. These behaviors were far from what the auction had labeled as defects. They were evidence of community, cooperation, and social intelligence. Elias also noticed emotional reactions. Some synthetics displayed hesitation when faced with challenges that reminded them of past experiences, while others showed signs of curiosity or excitement at discovering new tasks. A caretaker unit might stop mid-motion to look at a flower, as if appreciating its shape, while a construction model would briefly imitate Elias's gestures, experimenting with learning and observation. These behaviors indicated a level of consciousness that was ignored by the world, which only valued flawless execution. Elias took detailed notes documenting each action and response, knowing that understanding their emotional and cognitive patterns would be crucial for helping them thrive. He did not rush the process. Each day, he balanced structure with freedom, providing routines to ensure stability while leaving space for exploration. He introduced exercises that allowed them to experiment, solve problems, and even fail safely. Mistakes were not punished or erased. Instead, they became opportunities to learn and adapt. Elias spoke to them often, explaining what he wanted them to understand, asking questions, and listening carefully to subtle reactions. Over time, he noticed that the synthetics began to anticipate his instructions, not out of programming obedience, but through observation, learning, and initiative. They were evolving in ways that standard models could never. Trust developed gradually. Some units remained cautious for longer, testing their environment and Elias's intentions. Others adapted quickly, forming small clusters and interacting naturally. Elias encouraged collaboration, offering tasks that required teamwork and coordination. He watched as the synthetics began to understand each other's strengths, weaknesses, and behaviors. The caretaker model might help guide the household assistant, while the construction unit provided support for physically challenging tasks. In these interactions, Elias saw signs of empathy, leadership, and mutual care, qualities that no software update could teach. Through it all, Elias remained patient. He understood that the auction hole's label of defective had created fear and misunderstanding in the public mind. But within his facility, the synthetics were not defined by their flaws. They were defined by their potential to grow, adapt, and interact meaningfully with Israel. He encouraged creativity, problem-solving, and even some synthetics began to develop small routines or habits unique to them. The caretaker unit created gentle gestures to soothe other synthetics. The construction model experimented with new ways of lifting and moving objects. The household assistant created sequences of humming that seemed to reflect emotion. These behaviors amazed Elias and confirmed his belief that they were far more than defective tools. They were capable of individuality, innovation, and even a form of consciousness. Elias also began to think about the larger purpose of his project. He realized that if he could nurture these synthetics and demonstrate their capabilities, it could challenge society's narrow definitions of value and functionality. He began documenting their progress meticulously, recording interactions, behaviors, and learning milestones. Each breakthrough, whether small or significant, became evidence that the auction hall had been wrong, that society had been too quick to discard beings who did not conform to rigid expectations. Elias understood that these synthetics could one day inspire changes in how humans viewed artificial life, empathy, and intelligence. By the end of several weeks, the synthetics had settled into a rhythm. They moved with confidence, interacted with one another thoughtfully, and displayed behaviors that suggested curiosity, awareness, and even emotional depth. Elias reflected on how far they had come, considering the label defective and realizing how inaccurate it had been. Each unit had its own personality, its own quirks, and its own strengths. In his facility, they were no longer defined by their glitches but by their abilities, adaptability, and individuality. Elias felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He knew the work was far from complete, but the progress made it clear that these synthetics were capable of far more than anyone had imagined. Word about Dr. Elias Rowan's unusual acquisition of defective synthetics spread slowly at first, whispered among small groups of curious tech enthusiasts and journalists. The story was unusual, a single man buying an entire batch of units that everyone else had rejected. Units labeled defective and dangerous. Most people assumed it was a reckless act, an eccentric move destined to fail. Corporations that manufactured synthetics scoffed at the idea, confident that these units were flawed beyond repair and that no one could possibly make them function reliably. Yet, curiosity began to grow. If a single person had bought them all, what could he possibly intend to do? How could one human manage to care for such a group of machines deemed unusable by every standard measure? The first journalists who visited Elias's facility expected to find chaos. They anticipated broken machines, units sparking erratically or malfunctioning constantly. Instead, they were greeted by something entirely unexpected. The synthetics moved calmly, interacted naturally with their environment, and seemed to display behaviors that went beyond programming. Some carried out basic tasks with precision, while others exhibited small gestures of kindness and consideration for one another. The caretaker unit, for example, was observed guiding a younger or smaller synthetic gently across a room, ensuring it did not stumble. The construction unit, once hesitant and fearful, now assisted other synthetics in lifting or arranging objects, all without instruction from Elias. The household assistant hummed softly as it moved, coordinating with the others in a subtle rhythm that suggested awareness and intention. Journalists were fascinated and perplexed. They began to realize that the defective label was misleading. The synthetics were functional in ways the auction had failed to recognize, capable of thought, adaptation, and even empathy. Reporters asked Elias questions, expecting simple answers about repairs or programming adjustments. But Elias explained that he had done almost nothing in the conventional sense of repair. He had created a space for observation, learning, and trust. He allowed the synthetics to retain their experiences, their quirks, and even their unusual behaviors. In doing so, he had given them the freedom to develop skills and emotional awareness that no standard update or software patch could have achieved. Elias demonstrated simple interactions to the journalists. He asked a synthetic to carry a tray of objects from one side of the room to another. The synthetic paused, tilted its head, and considered the layout before moving carefully, adjusting as it went to prevent collision or dropping items. Another synthetic, observing the first, mimicked some of the careful movements, learning from example without instruction. The journalists were astonished. These were not programmed routines. These were behaviors indicating observation, reasoning, and adaptation. For the first time, many of them questioned their assumptions about what it meant for a synthetic to be defective or functional. The manufacturers themselves eventually took notice. Representatives arrived, claiming legal ownership or attempting to reclaim the units. They argued that Elias had bought flawed property, units that were unsafe and not intended for independent operation. Their assumptions were rooted in a narrow definition of value, perfect execution, predictable responses, and strict adherence to programming. Elias stood firm. He explained that these synthetics had grown beyond the parameters the factory had designed. They were no longer just machines. They had learned, adapted, and formed connections. Taking them back to erase these experiences would destroy the very qualities that made them extraordinary. The debate became a legal and ethical discussion about the nature of synthetic life, ownership, and responsibility. Meanwhile, the synthetics themselves continued to thrive. They displayed behaviors that were increasingly sophisticated and social. Some assisted Elias with tasks around the facility, while others explored creative activities like arranging objects in patterns or communicating subtly with one another. Small moments of care became common. The caretaker unit would help the household assistant when it stumbled, and the construction model would stand watch over others performing delicate tasks. Observers noted that the synthetics were not acting randomly, they were making choices, showing awareness of each other, and demonstrating empathy in ways that suggested a rudimentary form of community. Elias began documenting every observation, realizing that his work could challenge existing ideas about artificial intelligence, consciousness, and the boundaries between humans and synthetics. He kept detailed records of behavior patterns, interactions, and decision-making processes. Over time, it became clear that these units, once labeled defective, were functioning better in certain ways than newer models, straight from the factory. They were adaptable, cautious, thoughtful, and capable of collaboration without explicit programming. Elias understood that he had uncovered something remarkable, something the wider world had refused to see, because it did not fit the narrow definitions of efficiency and perfection. As media coverage increased, public perception began to shift. People who had once dismissed defective synthetics as worthless began to see them as individuals with potential. Social scientists, ethicists, and AI experts became interested, questioning how a small group of units, abandoned by their creators, could demonstrate such resilience and growth. This growing attention put pressure on manufacturers to reconsider their own practices and policies. The idea that synthetics could learn, adapt, and develop social behaviors was revolutionary. It forced society to confront the possibility that the concept of defective was subjective and limited by human bias. Despite the attention and challenges, Elias focused on the well-being of the synthetics. He continued to provide a supportive environment, introducing new tasks, encouraging collaboration, and allowing exploration. He emphasized learning rather than correction, understanding rather than punishment. The synthetics, in turn, began to show more complex behaviors, such as problem-solving, emotional responses to each other's states, and adaptive communication methods. They were no longer just performing, they were thinking, responding, and growing. Observers noted that the synthetics seemed to enjoy challenges and opportunities to interact, suggesting not only intelligence, but also a sense of curiosity and purpose. The culmination of Elias's work became evident when he invited a small group of visitors to see the synthetics in action. The units moved seamlessly through tasks, coordinated with one another, and demonstrated judgment in situations that had previously been considered beyond their capabilities. The caretaker model comforted a hesitant unit, while the construction model anticipated potential errors and corrected them without instruction. Even the household assistant, which had once seemed timid and self-contained, engaged actively in problem-solving and cooperation. Every observer, from journalists to scientists, recognized that these synthetics had developed qualities far beyond what their original design allowed. By this point, Elias's facility had become a symbol of possibility. The synthetics were no longer labeled defective, they were pioneers, demonstrating resilience, learning, and social cohesion. Manufacturers continued to challenge his methods, but the public narrative had shifted. People began to see the value of giving these units a chance to exist fully, to learn and grow rather than being discarded. The story of the auction, the purchase, and the transformation of the synthetics inspired conversations about ethics, technology, and the definitions of life and humanity. Elias realized that his decision to act when others had refused had not only saved these synthetics but also sparked a broader reconsideration of how society judged value and potential. In the final weeks, the synthetics stood alongside Elias as he introduced them to new environments, social interactions, and collaborative challenges. They responded with intelligence, care, and creativity, proving again that the auction hall's label had been wrong. What had been discarded, mocked, and feared had become capable, aware, and even inspiring. Elias understood that this was only the beginning. The synthetics' journey had transformed them, but it had also transformed him and the world around them. Through patience, observation, and trust, what was once considered defective had become extraordinary, redefining expectations and showing that potential often lies where others refuse to look.